in the middle of chapter 3, which is very exciting because we're going to really get into our topic at great depth very shortly. The packet that I made copies of tonight, the new packet, which has the English on the left side, which is just 2 pages, is the 13 Principles of Faith as copied from the ArtScroll Siddur. This is not the original 13 Principles of Faith as the Rambam wrote them, which is much longer. These are a shorter version. I'm not sure who originally, I think it's quite old, but I don't know who originally did the short version of the 13 Principles of Faith that some people like to say every day after davening. But these are them. These are this is the summary of the 13 Principles of Faith. You can read it. There's some notes on the bottom that ArtScroll's put in here. This is just the small copies, 2-page copies. So I mostly just brought these for you you can take them home, you can read them, you can look at them, and to have them, it's nice. You have the list of the 13 Principles of Faith, at least in their short version. But this is a good way to get to know them, and you can to familiarize yourself with these principles. Okay. Last week we explained that the first 5 of the 13 Principles of Faith all talk about God. We're on page 60. Well, we're going to be on page 62, but my review is starting on page 60. Right at the bottom of the left column where it says V'chamisha Elu, right? The first 5 principles deal with they deal with God. The first 5 principles talk about God more or less directly. And the other 8 talk about the Torah and reward and punishment. Those are basically the 3 categories of the 13 principles. And the first 5 talk about God. Right, and we explained last week that there's different opinions. Right, the Ikrim says that the first 5 he counts the first 5 principles of the Rambam as all being one principle. Right, that there is a God. Right? He sees them all as branches, sort of the same tree. The Rambam separates them for his own reasons into 5 separate principles. And those 5 principles were, let's review them. The 5 principles are: the first is that God is the Mechuyev HaMetzias, God is the necessary being, and does not need anything else to exist. That's what God is. The second principle is that God is true oneness. This is page 63. Number 2 is that he is true oneness. The third principle is that he does not have a body nor the potential for a body. The fourth principle is that he is not dependent on time. And the fifth principle is that he has infinite power, right? And he does whatever he desires to do and has no deficiencies and lacks nothing. He has no deficiencies whatsoever. These are the first 5 principles. Now, as we touched on last week, there's very good reason why the Ikrim considers all 5 of these principles to be branches of one central principle. And really we're gonna get more into that tonight, because it turns out that, logically speaking, if you are saying that there is a God and you're defining God, right, rather than a God, right? Let's back up for a moment, right? Monotheism, right? The belief that we share with Islam and to some extent Christianity, that there is one God, the one God who is the creator of the entire universe and the creator of everything. Monotheism is distinct from the philosophies which preceded it and from all the religions that preceded it. And not just in quantity, but in quality as well. In other words, the common canard, the chestnut that some people say that the Jews stop believing in the thousands of other gods, and I just stop believing in one more, right? An atheist might say, right? You stop believing in all in Zeus and in all the pagan gods. I just stop believing in one more God, right? That's a fundamental miscategorization, right? When we get into what God is, and when I say what God is, I don't mean God as he is revealed, God in his revelation. I don't mean the God who came down on Mount Sinai and said, "I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt." That's one thing. I'm talking about the God that so to speak, that the philosophers would argue are always accessible, that a person could realize, even if God didn't come down on Mount Sinai, a person would realize that there must be a God. right? That God, that one God, is fundamentally and categorically different than the idea of a God. So there's God with a capital G, and then there's a God, or the many gods of the pagan way of thinking. Now, the difference is that one God is a creator of everything and a necessary being, and the other gods are not. In the pagan conception, a God is merely an elevated form of human characteristics, right? You have the strongest person, or the most noble person, or whatever the human qualities are that the society values, right? You have the most intuitive person, the person who knows the most, the wisest person. Whatever values the society values, you elevate it, and you assign it to a supernatural being, right? So that being becomes the God of whatever you're talking about. And really what this leaves you with is something more akin to comic book superheroes than, or more charitably, heroes from literature than the actual God. The God of monotheism, God with a capital G, is distinct from all other types of God because philosophically he is a necessary being. He is not merely a being that could exist, right? He's not like a God of thunder who is a limited being within the world and whose existence could be proven or disproven through evidence within the world. The argument for God in all three major monotheistic religions, if we're willing to call Christianity a monotheistic religion, which is Judaically controversial, but assuming we're willing to call Christianity a monotheistic religion, all three major monotheistic religions argue that their God is not merely part of the creation, but rather God is the necessary being. God precedes all of the creation. And the argument is, and it's the oldest argument for God, and it's still a very, very good argument in my very humble opinion, the argument is that if a limited being exists, and it is limited, then something must have preceded it, right? By very definition of its limitation. If it's limited, if it's contingent, it depends on something else, so then something else must precede it. Not necessarily even in time, right? Even at the same time, right? The famous example is if you're playing music, the existence of the music in the air is preceded by the musician, not in time, but in causality, right? It needs something else to cause it. It doesn't exist on its own. The music as it is in the air is really a concurrent expression of something more fundamental. If it weren't for the musician, the music wouldn't be there, right? I'm getting into too much into the details, but whatever. The idea is that if you have a contingent being that depends on something else, then something must precede it, either in time or in so to speak, in causality. One causes the other, right? Now the argument is that if the previous cause is also limited and is also contingent and also is not infinite and must have been created, then something must precede that. And the argument is that this can't go on forever. There must be something that starts the process, right? Otherwise, none of these things would have existence. None of these things ever would have began to exist or could even exist now. And so therefore there must be something which concludes this process. There must be something which comes first. There must be a mover who is not an unmoved mover, as Aristotle would say, or an uncreated creator in the more religious understanding. And that uncreated creator is nothing other than God. Right? It's important to understand the argument because the argument makes clear what we mean by a necessary being. Right? There must be a being who is not contingent, who is not dependent on something else to exist, but rather simply is and always has been. And this is the very God that in Jewish philosophy we say is our God. This is the God that exists, the God who creates the entire universe. Now, why is this important for tonight's class? Because as we're going to see, as you'll remember, we said that the distinction between knowledge and faith has to do with a distinction in different expressions of godliness. And the first thing you have to deal with is how is it that this God that I've just described can have godliness and can have an expression of himself that is godly. And what does it mean that there's different levels of godliness, different expressions of God? Because the reason why that's problematic, as we're going to see, is that if you posit that there is this first necessary being, there are many other things that follow from this automatically, right? That's why the Ikrim says that this is really only one principle. If you say that there's a necessary being, you don't need to have all different separate principles to say that he exists above time and he exists above space and he has infinite power and he doesn't have a body. All of these things follow automatically, right? Let's take, for example, and really this is going to be our tonight we're going to talk about the second principle of faith, which is that he is true oneness, that God is utterly unified, right? There's only, in other words, he doesn't have parts. He's one God, and he has no parts, which really you can see how that connects to he doesn't have a body or potential for a body. He is perfect oneness. He is pure simplicity. He simply is God. There are no aspects to God. There's no divisions within what God is. Why is that? Why must that be? For a very simple reason, if you think about it, right? If you have, let's say you have a person, right? A person has a right hand and a left hand. Yeah, I'm saying this very coarse. It's not. So which one is more important is a separate issue. You're right, but let's assume that they can exist in harmony, right? The question is not whether they fight with each other. The question is a little bit deeper. The question is that if you have a right hand and a left hand, what you're already saying is that the two of them exist within a system that includes both of them. Right? Clearly the right hand and if you say there's a right hand and a left hand to a person, that means that there is a person, which is a broader category, and the person has a right hand and a left hand. Therefore, the right hand and the left hand are necessary or contingent. They're obviously contingent. In order to explain right hand and left hand, in order for them to exist, there must be the larger category which includes both of them. There's clearly a system, a category that causally precedes them. The hands are caused and are defined by the system that they're part of, right?
But this is our understanding. Maybe it's it's not the word, but maybe it's a creature that every single part of it is like, bicycle chain. You take one link and the thing doesn't move. So why does it make a difference if it's one part or many parts which has equally the same?
If you have, so what you're really saying then is that the parts, right? The problem with a chain or a system or a body is that the parts are dependent on the whole and the whole is dependent on the parts. Right? In other words, neither of these things are God. The whole is not God because it's dependent. It's caused by the parts. If you didn't have the parts, there would be no whole.
It's the same entity. It's like
What you can't? How is it the same entity?
Yeah, but it's an inanimate object.
No, but how is it the same? It's not the same entity. What is God? Is God all of the links together? If God is all of the links together, then none of the links is God. There must be something beyond the links, which is God. Right? The whole idea of working together to be one being. The one being has to precede the working together. Otherwise, he's not the first cause. You understand? You understand what I'm saying? The parts. If the parts are necessary to the being, then the being is not necessary. Then the being needs the parts. Right? So which one causes which? It's the same thing in the other direction, right? If you want to say that the individual part is God, right? Then you have the same problem. The part is defined and needs the whole. It needs the other parts, right? So if it needs anything else to define it, to make it what it is, then it's not the original necessary thing. Though from this we see it's a rather straightforward logical conclusion that the original necessary thing cannot be made up of parts. It cannot be divided. It can't have these divisions in these parts, right? The problem now, that's the necessary. So the Jewish philosophers like the Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim, right, would argue, for example, would argue that the conclusion that there is a necessary God is absolutely inescapable, logically, right? This is part of what we can know, if you remember. This is part of what we can know. We can know that there is a God, the necessary being, right? The question is, the Rambam says that what it means that he's a necessary being is something which is taken on faith, which maybe we'll talk about a little more later. But then he would say that it's also absolutely logically necessary that God doesn't have any parts, right? God is totally indivisible. God is one. Now, the problems this causes for everything else in Judaism are immense, right? The problems are immense. The idea that God is one and cannot have any part is in a sense in direct contradiction with almost everything else that you can possibly say about the creation. And much of the Moreh Nevuchim is about how God maintains his oneness even though the world is created from God. And that's much of what Jewish philosophy, and indeed most monotheistic religious philosophy, is attempting to explain, is how there can be a God who is one, and yet is the creator of the world, and to whatever extent is involved in the world, knows about the world, right? All these different things. That is the starting off point for what we are going to talk about in this chapter. Okay, so we are on page.
Except for the Trinity, because
yeah, that's the thing. It's controversial in Judaism whether or not Christianity is in fact a monotheism. And in fact, lahalacha, you're not supposed to go into a church because it's considered as a place of idol worship, whereas you are allowed to go into a mosque because they're both controversial. That Christianity is a vodazara is also controversial, but the idea is that generally speaking, historically, I don't really know much about the religions, but Islam has apparently been much stricter about their monotheism than Christianity has. Let's just put it that way.
I want to have two questions. I mean, the first one, if you look at other beliefs, I don't even want to call them religions, like the Greeks. So they also had gods. I mean, obviously for us it's like pagan, but they call them the name God. I mean, where is it coming from?
The actual word?
The name and the concept of having a God.
The Jewish explanation for where it came from, in the very short version, is explained by the Rambam in the laws of Avodah Zarah and Mishnah Torah, which are very interesting laws in general. The Rambam explains over there, short version, that originally there was a knowledge in the world, as we know from Adam and Eve, that there was one God and the one God was the creator. But there arose in people's minds an idea that even though there is a one God, God works through messengers. Right, like there's vessels for God's expression. Even though God is the one that gives me my food, He works through the wind and the rain and the sun and the moon and all these different things, and the Nile or whatever it is. And so people began to thank the messenger also, right? Because you thank, as it says, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the Gemara, it says somewhere that you thank the king, but the food is the king's, but the food is the master's, but you thank the waiter as well, right? You thank the waiter for your food, the vessel which brings the food to you. And eventually, over time, this degraded into a worship of the vessels of the beneficence over God Himself, and God is forgotten. Pardon?
Paganism existed before.
Not according to the Chumash.
Before Adam and Chava?
Before Adam and Eve, there was
because before Adam and Eve, before Abraham was revealed.
That's a different thing. That's a rediscovery. That's a rediscovery of monotheism.
Revealed himself to Adam and Eve, so I mean,
yeah,
he was there before. It was like from the
yeah. So when that was Abraham's original greatness before God revealed Himself to him. In fact, you could argue that's why God revealed Himself to Avram, because Avram discovered monotheism on his own through this process, through the philosophical process of trying to discover who is the greatest God. He stumbled onto the idea that there must be one original God. That's why Abraham is the inventor of monotheism, because this idea he arrived at on his own, that there is one God.
Why gods? I mean, it's like, we know God because, it's written here. How come the Greek, they had the goddess? It's like, was there a need to copy what the Jews had? Where did it come from?
It evolved.
There's a couple of different ways of looking at it. One thing that's certainly true is that as explained in the Talmud, is that the impulse to Avodah Zarah, and in general the impulse to idol worship, and the general idea that a person needs to be spiritual, that the world is not material, was something that people felt much more keenly in the early ages of the world. The Talmud explains that the desire to worship idols was largely removed from the world. At some point, there's a whole story with the sages in Jerusalem. It's a whole long discussion. There used to be a much more powerful impulse to worship idols, which came along with, which was a direct result from a clearer perception that the world is spiritual and not material. And really, if you look at the progression of how people have thought over time, the conclusion that people have that the world is entirely material, and basically that there is no spiritual aspect to the universe, has slowly over time basically degraded.
So was Noah a idol worshiper before God revealed Himself?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I don't think so. I have a feeling not.
So he was the first monotheist.
No, but he had a tradition. That was the difference. The difference is that he would have learned from his father, Shem and Aver, right? We say that Shem and Aver didn't worship idols, and they were still around in the time of Avram. And I'm not clear on all the details, to be honest.
Be like idol,
No, he's saying because it was lost, and then Avram rediscovered it. So he says maybe Noach was an idol worshiper.
but I mean, it came from Adam Rishon. Why was
No, but Avram rediscovered it on his own
How do you know that he rediscovered it?
Because Terach had idols.
because
Salesman for idols. His father.
His father was Idols R.S.
He had.
Maybe it was an addition, like they created the Egel Azav. So they knew there was God, they didn't believe, but I mean, okay, so let's create something else.
the Egel Azav is a different story. That's maybe even related to what we're trying to learn tonight. Maybe we'll get back to it. Okay, page 62. V'hinei bebir inyan echad ha'emes. The explanation of the idea that God is the true oneness, true simplicity. He is one in the deepest sense of what that word means. Hainu, what does this mean? She'enoi murkav mishum kechonius chas v'shalom. That he is not a composite of any powers, God forbid. God is not a composite. God does not have parts. God does not have divisions. God is utter simplicity. He is simple with the ultimate simplicity. Footnote 4 notes that this means his existence has no definition whatsoever, which is also true, because if you a definition, by definition, requires that there be some aspect, some defining aspect that you can grasp something by. Definition, in fact, the word in a lot of Torah for definition is geder, right? Ze geder, this is the geder of the thing. And geder literally means fence, right? To define something is to fence it in. To define the definition already limits something.
Frame it, yes.
Yeah. So something to have definition is a limitation, as the Rambam goes to great lengths to explain in Moreh Nevuchim. Yeah. Ulazais huksha lefilosofim b'inyan ha'Torah u'mechrachim l'Torah Hashem Yisbarich. Therefore, the philosophers had a problem. The philosophers questioned the necessary titles with which we must describe God. We're referring to the Jewish philosophers. The Jewish philosophers, I think, or maybe Jewish and non-Jewish together, we're talking about the necessary descriptions you must have for God, right? So we just said that God is utter simplicity, which means that he can't be defined, right? You immediately run into problems. The first problem you run into, famously, as the Rambam talks about, is that the first definition you can ascribe to God is that God exists. Right? This is extremely problematic, as the Rambam says, and in fact the Rambam concludes that the only extent to which God exists is to the extent that we negate that he doesn't exist. But to say that God exists in the affirmative, it's like hold your horses. There's too much limitation for the Rambam's taste. Maimonides says to say that God exists, existence has a definition. Existence means an instantiation of a form, and existence means a joining of matter and form, something like that. And God obviously has no such limitations. God has no such divisions. God is completely simple. So even to say he exists is a problem. And then, once you get beyond existence, you have all sorts of other things that we have to call God, right? For example, Kagan, top of page 65, Kagan, Beshu Chacham v'Yedea, to say that God is wise and knowing. You're going to say that God is, God forbid, foolish or doesn't know something, right? I thought we say that God is omniscient. Right? God, by definition, knows everything. Right? This is one of the other principles is that he has infinite power. He has no limitation. So therefore, he must know everything. And not just that, but it's stated in the Torah that he knows. Right? And if the Torah says God is wise, right? The Torah says many things about God, many descriptors of God. One of the things it says is God is wise. Right? God is a chacham. God knows. If this is true, then his knowledge is an additional trait on his etzem, on what he is. Right? You have God, and then you have God's knowledge.
How could it be?
This is a
What is one?
That's what I'm saying. This is exactly the problem, right? The problem is that you say God knows something. As soon as you can't say God doesn't know anything. You can't say God there's anything that you can't say there's anything God doesn't know, right? That's imposing a limitation on his knowledge. The Torah says God knows, God is wise. On the other hand, to say that God does know implies that there's God, and then there's his knowledge, right? Just like a person. A person knows. There's the person, and there's the person's knowledge. This is a major problem. If you have God and God's knowledge, then we're back to the original point, right? God is defined by having knowledge. That means that God is not God. God is not the necessary being. There's something else which lends existence to God. Maybe God's knowledge is actually God, but it's only God's knowledge, right? God's knowledge needs God to know it, so God's knowledge can't be God. And then we have a problem. So who's God anyway, right? We need a simple, necessary being to be God. It's a major problem to say that God has knowledge. So it seems, the question is a very strong one. We're stuck, right? There's God, and there's God's knowledge, and the Torah says God knows. But what can this mean if God is an absolutely simple being? If he's pashut b'tachlis apshitus.
Why is knowledge not God then? If you have knowledge, you can create and do.
No, sure, but the thing is that God. The problem is that God can't have parts. That's the problem.
It's not a part.
What is it?
Oh, you said that God is knowledge.
No, it's just knowledge. So if it's not clear how you could have knowledge that's not a part of God. Right? What is knowledge? What does it mean? What does it mean he knows?
Like a book.
No, he said God is knowledge. That's what he says. But
God
you define
is
him.
knowledge.
So you defined him.
So then
it cannot be not knowledge. So where is the godliness in there?
God is knowledge. So then the question becomes knowledge of something specific.
No, everything.
Everything. The problem with right. The problem is that if God is everything, this makes our problem infinitely worse. Doesn't solve it. And that means God has an infinite number of parts. That's unconscionable. What?
Why is that a part?
Why is it not?
Knowledge is a single
What do you mean? Knowledge is a single concept. So then I ask again, knowledge of what? So then he can't know anything that has multiple parts or multiple concepts, right?
But that's just knowledge.
It's just knowledge. What is just knowledge?
Multiple objects.
Right.
Or events.
It's a problem.
Create new ones.
So the knowledge grasp. No, it's a good point you're bringing up, and this is actually part of the discussion that Rambam goes into. That a knowledge of multiplicity is itself multiplicitous, right? If you know two things, the knowledge itself now has two parts, right? It's not that two things form one simple knowledge. Knowledge is clearly comprised of parts and compartmentalized, right? As many things as you know about is how many parts your knowledge has, right? It's clear that knowledge isn't the Rambam has there's no mysteries to the Rambam about what knowledge is and what it means for a person to know, right? In classical philosophy, and as the Rambam explains it, and although this is very different than the modern way of thinking about it, it is a very profound way of thinking about it. The Rambam explains that to know something is to apprehend its form, right? The form is what makes the thing what it is, right? The form of the table. It's brown and it has a certain size. What's a worldly concept? What do you mean?
Something that's round.
Sure. The thing is that the thing is that the Rambam's trying to understand. If you can just relegate everything to beyond that, then you may as well not even enter into the process of trying to understand in the first place, right? That's what the Rambam would say to all such things, right?
Well, that is an option, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
it's a big
Yeah.
problem.
Not if you want to understand.
There's an expression, you never know until you know. So since we don't know what God knows or doesn't know, we don't know, like anything.
Oh, so you're saying you're saying our ignorance covers for him. He manages to slide by.
Maybe there are some things that he doesn't know, but we do not know even how to express them.
No, if God is the original creator of the universe, and he's simple and he's infinite and he has all these traits that we say he has, which we haven't gone through every one and explained why it's logical derivation.
To this universe, but maybe there's
I'm not limiting his knowledge at all. I'm saying if he knows even two things, it's a problem.
Right.
Perhaps even if he knows one thing, it's a problem because you still have knowledge in God himself.
Yeah.
So it's a problem. It's a philosophical problem. It has nothing to do with, as the modern mind finds very frustratingly when you come to the Rambam and the more classical, the older ways of thinking, the older philosophies, you'll find that the problems are very, very hard to wriggle out of with new evidence, right? New evidence is something which allows you to wriggle out of inductive problems, right? You think that you came up with a theory because of all the evidence that you have. If you come up with new evidence, your theory changes, right? The old philosophy is not like that at all. The old philosophy is more like math, right? There's no new evidence for the Pythagorean theorem. New evidence will not arise. It's not that type of thing. It's not inductive. It's deductive, right? Unless the few fundamental principles change of our thinking, it's very hard to avoid these conclusions. Anything could happen. Anything could happen. You're right. Right. There's non-Euclidean geometries, but if one is arguing that they have changed, when I say basic principles of knowledge, I mean like something exists is like the type of thing I'm talking about. Something exists, right? The rules of logic apply, things like that, right? Very basic foundations to understanding that it would be very challenging to understand anything at all without these foundations. And the Rambam, upon that, builds a very powerful understanding of a God who is infinite and the creator of the entire universe and who has no parts, etc.
Okay, so this is the thing. I mean, does it make a difference?
Does what make a difference?
I mean, if God knows, or we think He knows everything, or He doesn't.
Sure.
Why does it make a difference? I mean, He revealed Himself to our fathers. He actually make solid the fact that He does exist, and the rest is like, this is it.
The rest is history. It's our knowledge that's limited, not His.
Yes.
So our definitions are really, our concepts, not really what is.
If God makes sense, given that everything makes sense, these conclusions are necessary, in the Rambam's opinion. Given that everything makes sense, these conclusions are necessary, in the Rambam's opinion.
But isn't it where the emunah comes into place? Because I mean, we cannot define it.
No, see, isn't this interesting? So the world thinks that the world thinks that the emunah.
Emunah being spirit?
People make emunah as faith. People.
Isn't it spirit as well?
No,
Spirit.
ruach is spirit. When people, we spoke about before how when the type of faith we're talking about is not the faith that when you have questions that are too hard, right, you just sort of resort to that faith. That's the type of faith that religion is mocked with, right? That people say that you stop thinking and you just rely on faith. The fascinating thing is that when it actually comes to the process of thinking, often the people who would make that accusation aren't willing to follow the conclusions to where it leads. In other words, thinking is hard, right? Emunah is easy. Thinking is the challenge, to know and to understand as much as we can understand. This is the hard part. You can relegate everything to emunah, and then you could just be 4 years old forever.
Otherwise, you may reach conclusions which are not right.
No, that's a separate thing. That's a separate thing. There's a foundation of emunah. The foundation of emunah is built on with intellect. These are two separate things. The foundation of emunah is not for a person to keep for their entire life. It's not the only thing you're supposed to have. It's like saying I should be a child forever, right? That's not right. A child has a simple faith in God, a 3-year-old, right? It's not right for an adult to be a 3-year-old forever. There's more expectations of us, and part of those expectations are to understand God. Chachma, wisdom. If God has wisdom, the wisdom would seem to be an addition to what He is. There's Him and His wisdom, and this is a major problem for a true monotheism, like Judaism is. And the Rambam would argue for reality, because reality is a monotheistic reality. So to answer this question, the Rambam says as follows, and this is what he says this is as he says it in Mishnah Torah, the laws of the foundations of the Torah. This is what the Rambam says. This is very famous. It's very famous to me because it's brought in a footnote in Tanya, but it's also very famous because this is how the Rambam answers this very difficult question. The Rambam says as follows. Does someone have a watch, by any chance, that I could borrow? Okay. HaKadosh Baruch Hu makir amitay. The Holy One, blessed be He, knows His truth, v'yedea Esa, kamei shehi, and knows it as it is. Ve'ena yodea b'deya shechutz mimeno. He doesn't know this with a knowledge that is external to himself, kamei she'anu yodim, as we know. She'ein anu v'da'atenu echad, because as we know, we and our knowledge are not one, right? We are beings who then know as one of the many things we do, right? Knowledge, we are not our knowledge, right? We clearly extend beyond our knowledge, right? We have volition, we desire things, we do things, we enjoy things, right? We exist in the physical world, we have bodies, there's many, many things we do. Knowledge is only one of them. Knowledge is part of what we do. Us and our knowledge are separate. The Rambam says God does not know the way we know. God and his knowledge are not separate. With regards to the Creator, he, his knowledge, his life are one. From every side and direction and every way of unity.
This is like trying to define God.
No, it's the opposite. But we'll talk about that in a minute. That's a good point. But it's not defining God. For were he to be alive with a life like everything else is alive, and he knew with the knowledge outside of him, there would be many gods, right? There would be him and his knowledge and his life and all sorts of other things. Hu v'chayav v'daita, there would be him and his life and his knowledge. This is not what is true. Rather, they are one from every direction and from every side and in every way of unity. Nimtza ata omer. So what you can say about him is hu hayodea. This is the famous line: hu hayodea v'hu hayadua v'hu hadeya atzma. That he is the knower, he is what is known, and he is the knowledge itself.
How do you know?
Pardon?
How do you know?
That's what the Rambam says.
No, how does he know even?
How does he know? Because he. 1 second. First, what does he know? Then, how does he know? 1 second. What does he know? The Rambam says that
Where's the sources for the Rambam?
well, pardon me?
Those sources that's stated.
What the Rambam is saying there, I'm not sure if there is a Torah source for what he is saying. I think this is a logical
But it's called based
conclusion on the Rambam's part. No, the Rambam operates within Torah.
What do you say? I don't know. What is that?
There had to be other sources.
Sure, at least it doesn't contradict anything. The truth is, I don't know. There could be a source. You're right. I don't know.
We cannot say part, but the way
The Rambam is saying like this. The Rambam is saying that the reason why he's operating in knowledge and nothing else, right? The reason why he doesn't say, you could say, the first thing to say is this. We could say in principle, the Rambam could say in principle here, that God is the lover, the loved, and the love. For the same price. Okay? Or any other function, or any other expression, right? God is the maker, the making, and the made, or whatever it is you'd like to call it.
Is God good and evil?
Well, how is that even connected? How is that even really? I'm curious how it's even connected to the class. The Rambam says knowledge is the highest of all capacities. In other words, in the Rambam's understanding, knowledge is the highest thing that there is in the world. Knowledge and the intellect is the highest of all creations. And there's various reasons for why you would say that. But in the ordering of the universe, which not just to the Rambam, but to most people was self-understood, once upon a time, knowledge and intellect is the highest of all functions, right? First of all, this is what separates humans from animals, right? It's what the angels do. The angels are occupied with conceiving of God, according to the Rambam. The Rambam says that the reward for the soul after passing away is a knowledge of God in Gan Eden, right? Everything revolves around knowledge. Knowledge is the highest of all things in the creation. So that's why the Rambam says it about knowledge. Really, you could say it about other things as well. And really, what the Rambam is saying is that as things go higher, and as things exist within the Creator, there are no divisions. There are no divisions between things. Everything is one. In other words, God's loving and God's knowing are the exact same thing, and neither of them is defined in the way that we normally define them. He does not love with a love that is one part of who He is, right? And if we say that love is not only one part of who you are, we totally lose our grasp on what love means, right? It's very hard to understand even what it means. It's not one person is loving something. It's the essence of love. It's means of love. And the Rambam goes further that love and knowledge and all of these other universals, all of these other fundamental expressions are all one. They're all the same thing, and that one thing, which it is God. So God doesn't love or know. God only gods. Right? What does it mean that God gods? It has three aspects, and the three are one. And if it sounds like Christianity, that's not a mistake. That's not a coincidence. Let's put it that way. Right. This idea was very enamored to the Christians, right? They took it in a direction that the Rambam would have fervently disagreed with, but this idea is not unknown to the Christian scholars. That there is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, and they're all one. There is the subjective knower. There's the knowee, there's what God knows, and there's the knowledge, which is the faculty that God uses to know it. But in God, these things have no separation. It's the same with everything else. There's the lover, the loved, and the love itself. In God, this is all simply God. This is all simply an expression of godliness, right?
How do you even know that God has something that is called love? This is like
that's exactly what the Rambam's saying.
No,
that's exactly what the Rambam's saying. You're right. That's exactly what the Rambam's saying. The Rambam's saying exactly that in a more sophisticated way because he thought about it longer. He's saying exactly that in a more sophisticated way. He's saying God doesn't have love. God doesn't have knowledge. At least not the way we'd define them. God is simply God. But what does it mean that He's simply God? It means that in Him, these three things, or these three aspects, which is basically party A, party B, and the power, or whatever combines them, in God, these things are all one. There's only one God. In God, these things have no separation. So it's not that God has love. The Rambam actually says explicitly in More Nevuchim that God doesn't have love. I think we've discussed this in a previous class, that it's not that God is loving. It's the idea that God does things for a person that a loving person would do for someone that they love. But to actually say that God has love, you can't say. God has no definition. What it means that He has no definition.
God said it by Himself. It's like you cannot even define it.
In God, these things have no definitions. These are not limitations. In other words, the Rambam's way of saying that God doesn't have love or doesn't have knowledge is by saying that He is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. Right? First of all, he doesn't lack knowledge. He's perfect in His knowledge, but the form that His knowledge takes is not like our knowledge. He knows he knows by knowing Himself, and what He knows is Him, and the process of knowing it is also Him. It's all united as one. God simply gods, and all of these things, as with God verbing, so to speak, the verb of God. God gods, and what that means is that He does all three of these things as one. That's basically what the Rambam. That is put in another way. That is as far as the Rambam is willing to go in defining God. Does it say anything? Not really, right? The Christians like to think that it does.
No, because otherwise it would be it's like trying to.
Like I said, the Christians like to say that it does. Their Trinity is read into the philosophy at this juncture. We don't need to go into the details of that. In any case, the Rambam says that the Rambam's conclusion is that all knowledge of God is negative knowledge. There is no positive statement that can actually be said about what God is. The furthest that he's willing to go is to say that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. That's the furthest the Rambam is willing to go. And that's the answer to the question, how can God have knowledge? The answer is that God knows through knowing himself, and the process of knowing himself is itself himself. Right? And you go figure that out. Right? That's the Rambam's answer to the question. The answer of the Rambam to the question is that God does not have a separate faculty of knowledge. He knows by knowing himself, and in knowing himself, he is himself, and that's the knowledge, and it's all one, and it's God.
If you look at the dictionary, you cannot use the word that you're trying to describe. And this is exactly the same thing. It's like, no matter what you're going to say, you cannot describe it.
The
Rambam is not defining. The Rambam is not defining God.
God is God.
The Rambam is not defining God. That's exactly what I'm saying. And I think I've said it 3 or 4 times now. This is his way of not defining God. It's not him defining God. Okay, Ad kan l'shoneh. That's what the Rambam says. I have 5 more minutes. Okay. V'heidu lei chachmei Kabbalah gam ken b'zeh. Famously, the Alter Rebbe, this is what the Alter Rebbe writes in his note on Tanya. The Alter Rebbe writes something fascinating, and this is really going to be the jumping off point for the rest of our chapter. The Rambam writes that we are on page 67 near the bottom of the column on the right. The sages of the Kabbalah acknowledge the Rambam's understanding as well in this. The sages of the Kabbalah agreed. As the famous Ramak writes in his Pardes, and also according to the Arizal, students of the Kabbalah who may be present might know that the Ramak and the Arizal very famously argue about a lot of things in Kabbalah, but both of them would agree on this idea. Tzimach Tzedek, they both agree. With regard to the secret of the investiture of God's infinite light, the investiture of God's infinite light in the vessels of Chabad of Atzilus, of Chachma bin and Das, the knowledge, God's knowledge in the world of Atzilus, but not above Atzilus. Okay, let's stop here. For 5 minutes, I'm going to explain why this is significant and what it's saying. The Alter Rebbe says in the note on Tanya, that the Rambam's understanding of God, or the Rambam's, so to speak, way of phrasing his lack of understanding about God, right, more accurately, is true up to Chabad of Atzilus. In other words, when the Rambam is describing the knower, the knowledge, and the known, that is a true entity. That is God. But what he is describing is God as he expresses himself in the knowledge of Atzilus, in the first 3 spheres of the world of Atzilus, which is the highest of the 4 spiritual worlds. Right? In other words, here you find, and this is vital because you can understand all of Jewish philosophy and how all of it can sort of fit, most of it can fit as a subset within Chassidus and within the mystical understanding within Kabbalah, if you understand this concept, that the God that the philosophers are talking about is God, but it's only a certain expression of God. God, as he expresses himself in the world of Atzilus. When we say that there's 10 spheres in Atzilus, and those spheres are an infinite expression of God, but there are 10 of them, and they're expressed each one in a different way. There's Chochmah, there's Bina, there's Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. There's 10 different ways of God expressing himself in the world of Atzilus. This is, in fact, what the Rambam was talking about. When the Rambam refers to God as the knower, the knowledge, and the known, and how those things are all one, and how this is not an affirmative definition of God, but is rather a negative definition of God, saying that his abilities are not the same as our abilities, that his knowledge is not like our knowledge, that knowledge, which is not like our knowledge, is in fact the knowledge in the world of Atzilus. It's an expression of God in the world of Atzilus. Why is this significant? Because, as we're going,
limitation.
Pardon?
That's a limitation.
It absolutely is a limitation in the eyes of the Kabbalah. You have to remember from the very beginning of this class, at the beginning of this mimer, that the Kabbalah and philosophy work on very different scales. Right? What we consider to be faith in the eyes of philosophy was one of the forms of knowledge of Kabbalah. Right? You have to understand they work on different scales. The ultimate, essential, and unknowable God of the Rambam is merely an expression of God in the understanding of the Kabbalah. There are 2 different understandings here. But what's important about this is that we're going to see let's put it this way. One of the things that it's important about this is that there's We're going to have to discuss it more next class because it's too long, really. But the foundational idea is that the fundamental difference between Kabbalah and philosophy, Kabbalah and Jewish philosophy, the fundamental difference in their way of understanding and why they come to different conclusions. One says that this is God himself, whereas Kabbalah says this is only an expression of God. The difference is that the Kabbalah believes that there is such a thing as godliness, that there is an expression of God which is not God himself. The Rambam and philosophy, there's absolutely no proof and no reason to derive. There's no logical reason to say that such a thing exists, that there is a God and there's the expression of God which is not God but is also not a creation, right? And the as we've spoken about in previous classes, and because the Rambam doesn't have godliness, he has to say that this is God. Whereas the Kabbalah, because it has the concept of godliness, is able to climb higher and higher at great length. This is basically what the rest of our chapter is about. The rest of this chapter is going to be about the difference between philosophy and Kabbalah, and how where philosophy says is the absolute highest possible human understanding of God, the Kabbalah labels and says this is a very specific expression of God, and there's much higher things, and there's things which are beyond this, and that the Rambam's understanding and the philosophical understanding, the understanding of the mind and the understanding of logic, only goes so far. So basically what we're setting up, in summary of what we talked about today, we talked about extensively about the Rambam's conception of God, the philosophical understanding of God, which, remember, if everything is logical and everything must make sense, and given very basic initial premises, you must come to the conclusion that God is one, God is unified, God is simple, and he has no parts, and he is a necessary being. This must lead us further to the conclusion that when we say that God knows, or really that God does anything, right, that God has any aspect, when the Torah says that there are aspects of God, that God is wise or God is loving or anything else, what we're talking about is not the way that we love or we know or we have an expression. It's talking about this unified expression of God, that God's knowing and God's love, and that it's the what is loved and the love and the lover and the knower, the knowledge and the known it's all the same. Everything that God does exists in one unknowable unity. And we just started to touch on the idea that the Kabbalah recognizes this understanding of God up until the world of Atzilus, but no further. Up until the world of Atzilus, until the highest of the four spiritual worlds, this understanding of God holds. Above the world of Atzilus, that understanding does not hold. And really what we're going to talk, the conclusion of the chapter is going to be, the point of the chapter is to understand why, higher than the world of Atzilus, this understanding of God does not hold. Why is that the limit of how far the Rambam's, this understanding of God, and specifically of God's traits, right, like God's knowledge or God's love or anything like that, why it only extends that far and not further?
It's beyond our ability to comprehend. Is that the reason?
Pardon?
It's above our ability to comprehend.
As we're going to see in the rest of our chapter, we'll see.
In
We'll
this
see.
division, there's going to be a reconciliation, I think.
We already have a reconciliation. We said that what the Rambam believes, Kabbalah agrees with, up until the world of Atzilus.
But the philosophy and the Kabbalah are different at this point. You're showing the differences.
No, this is where they agree until. They agree until the world of Atzilus. Beyond that, there's differences.
So
Yeah.
Atzilus is the...
Is behavior a manifestation in some way of God?
It's a very loaded question. It depends who you ask. The Rambam would say no, not at all. The Rambam doesn't believe there is such a thing as an expression of God. When I say the Rambam believes, by the way, it's important. Let me finish this.